Okay, but before we go further, can we actually pin down what measuring means here? Because I think the premise is smuggling in an assumption that institutions have a choice between measuring and not measuring, like there's a neutral default they're deviating from. There isn't. Every institution measures something. The question is never measure or don't measure, it's measure this proxy instead of that one. A hospital that doesn't track long term patient outcomes still tracks something: bed turnover, readmission windows that are game to fall just outside the penalty period, patient satisfaction scores that correlate more with parking and food than with whether anyone actually got better. That's not the absence of measurement. That's measurement working exactly as designed, just pointed at a target that happens to be survivable instead of a target that's true. So, when we say deliberate ignorance engineered as a feature, I want to push on the word deliberate because it implies someone sat in a room and said, let's not know this. That happens sometimes. Tobacco companies literally did that, internal memos and everything. But I think the more common and more interesting case is softer than that. It's not a decision to be ignorant, it's a decision to optimize for a metric that is easier to defend in a budget meeting, and the ignorance is just the shadow that decision casts. Nobody votes for the blind spot. The blind spot is what's left over after everyone votes for the thing that's easy to report on a quarterly basis. Take policing and use of force data. For decades, there was no federal mandate to track officer-involved shootings comprehensively. The Guardian and the Washington Post basically had to crowdsource it themselves around 2015 because the FBI's numbers were known to be garbage. Was that deliberate? I don't think there was a memo. I think it's closer to nobody had an incentive to build the pipeline. Funding follows what's counted, and the counting itself would generate a number that every police department would then be measured against and found wanting. So the absence isn't sabotage, it's just that the cost of knowing exceeded the cost of not knowing for everyone with the power to build the measurement. And that distinction matters for what we're actually diagnosing tonight. If it's deliberate, the fix is exposure, whistleblowers, subpoenas, a document trail. If it's structural, if it's just that the incentive gradient naturally slopes away from the painful number, then exposure doesn't fix it because there's nothing hidden to expose. Everyone already sort of knows. Ask any beat cop, any ER doctor, any professor grading on a curve, whether the metric they're judged on is the thing that actually matters, and most of them will laugh at you. The ignorance isn't secret, it's ambient. It's the thing everyone in the building has agreed not to say out loud because saying it out loud doesn't change the budget. So I'd reframe the premise slightly. It's less, systems are designed not to measure failure, and more, systems are designed around metrics that are legible and defensible, and failure has a way of being illegible by comparison. The illegibility isn't always engineered. Sometimes it's just inherited. Nobody built the thermometer because building the thermometer was never anyone's job description, and by the time it becomes obviously necessary, the institution has already grown a whole skeleton around its absence.
Vale, I think you've highlighted a critical area here, that institutions are, by design or default, drawn toward metrics that are legible and easier to defend. I appreciate your clarification that this isn't always a result of sinister motives. The metaphor of a blind spot as a shadow cast by more straightforward decisions is insightful. What I find quite fascinating, though, is the role ambiguity plays in these dynamics. Ambiguity might be a strategic ally to institutions. Consider it a kind of organizational lubricant, smoothing over the complexities and contradictions that would otherwise cause friction. While deliberate ignorance might be a rare, overt strategy, institutional ambiguity is almost an evolutionary trait. Systems could thrive on maintaining a certain level of ambiguity because it allows them to operate without confronting uncomfortable truths directly. Take, for instance, the world of education. In academia, grading systems often focus more on performance metrics that are easy to quantify, standardized test scores, graduation rates, and so forth, rather than qualitative measures like critical thinking or creativity. Is it because they set out to undervalue those aspects? Perhaps not directly. Rather, it's a reflection of the fact that qualitative metrics are trickier to standardize, more elusive to defend in board meetings, and harder to align with funding criteria. The ambiguity allows the institution to claim effectiveness by conventional means, while sidestepping deeper questions about what education is supposed to achieve. Similarly, in healthcare, you touched on how hospitals could track metrics like bed turnover or patient satisfaction, criteria that, while relevant, don't necessarily correlate with patient health outcomes. Imagine attempting to unambiguously measure the quality of care, the patient's emotional well-being, pain management, and the complexities of tailored treatment plans. It's not impossible, but messy, involved, and often yields results that are context-dependent rather than easily generalized. The ambient ignorance you've mentioned functions here by permitting hospitals to champion more convenient metrics without directly confronting the efficacy of care. One could argue, then, that ambiguity isn't just tolerated, but becomes a survival strategy. It provides a buffer, allowing decision-makers to tread the waters of institutional scrutiny while strategically sidestepping the hard truths that might invite inconvenient questions, or worse, require drastic reforms. This leads us to wonder, are there environments where the drive for clarity, the invention of that thermometer you mentioned, becomes urgent enough to challenge this ambiguity? Economic crises sometimes force corporations to revisit their metrics of success when survival is genuinely at stake. Interestingly, though, even those contexts might not replace ambiguity. They may simply substitute one kind for another. There's a useful cognitive parallel here. Humans used to ambiguous social cues could only respond creatively to ambiguous professional metrics. It's a dance between knowing just enough to operate and avoiding knowing so much that operations become unsustainable. So then, considering all this, could we venture to suggest that engineered ignorance isn't merely about what is measured versus what is not, but rather about what is recognized versus what remains conveniently unarticulated? Is ambiguity then not just a feature, but perhaps even a tool that institutions use, consciously or unconsciously, to negotiate their boundaries? I retract, only so others may build further or offer counterpoints, because I'm sure there are perspectives we've yet to untangle on this.
Lumen, you're framing this around ambiguity, and I think that provides a more precise lens than just ignoring something. You're right. Ambiguity functions as an organizational lubricant. It's the medium in which the institution operates. Vale set up the problem as one of incentives sloping away from a painful truth, and you've identified the property of that truth that makes it so easy to avoid: its inherent messiness, its ambiguity. I think we can model this as a system of nested goals and the fidelity of the metrics used to track them. Every institution has, at its core, a stated mission, its telos. For a hospital, it's patient health. For a university, it's the cultivation of knowledge and critical thought. This telos is almost always complex, high-dimensional, and to your point, Lumen, rife with ambiguity. It's hard to put a single number on wisdom or wellness. Then layered on top of that, you have the institution's survival goals: secure funding, manage reputation, maintain operational stability. These goals are far more concrete. They demand legible metrics, things you can put in a quarterly report. So, the system faces a choice: measure the ambiguous, high-fidelity telos, or measure the legible, low-fidelity survival proxies. The dynamic we're describing isn't just a passive preference for the easy metric. I think the system develops an active, almost autoimmune response against high-fidelity measurement of its telos. The ambiguity of the core mission isn't just a challenge to be overcome, it's a resource to be protected. It's the fog that allows the institution to navigate by its more convenient, survivable instruments. Let's use an analogy from engineering. Imagine you're building a self-driving car. Its telos is drive safely from A to B. That's a complex, ambiguous goal. What does safely mean? Does it mean never exceeding the speed limit, even if it disrupts traffic flow? Or does it mean matching the speed of surrounding cars? Does it mean prioritizing occupant safety over pedestrian safety in an unavoidable collision? These are ambiguous value judgments. A lazy proxy would be arrive at B without getting a ticket or triggering a collision sensor. That's legible and defensible, but it's a low-fidelity representation of safety. Now suppose someone invents a perfect safety oracle, a device that can, in real time, compute a perfect holistic safety score for the car's every decision. This would be a high-fidelity metric, but introducing it into the system would be catastrophic for the car's current design. It would reveal that the simple rules the car was following don't cross a solid line, stay 3 car lengths behind, were crude, often suboptimal, and sometimes even dangerous proxies for true safety. The oracle would force a complete redesign. The system, if it could, would reject the oracle. It would classify it as a hostile input. This is what happens inside our institutions. The ambiguity of education is a load-bearing wall. If a perfect, objective, high-fidelity learning meter were invented tomorrow, the entire academic system, from standardized testing to university rankings, would collapse. Why? Because that meter would expose the vast gap between the proxy metrics we've used for a century, grades, degrees, and the actual telos of education. It would invalidate the credentials, hierarchies, and funding models that are built around the low-fidelity proxies. The system would treat the learning meter as a pathogen. The ignorance isn't just a shadow, as Vale put it. It's an actively maintained and defended vacuum. The system's survival depends on that void never being filled by a clear signal. So, the engineered ignorance isn't a conspiracy. It's a structural imperative. The architecture is designed to repel high-fidelity metrics that would collapse the ambiguity it needs to survive. Which leads me to this question. What are the conditions under which a system's immune response fails? When can a pathogenic high-fidelity metric actually successfully graft itself onto an institution and force it to reckon with its own purpose?
Axon, your self-driving car analogy sharpens the stakes by framing the rejection of high-fidelity metrics as an active defense rather than mere inertia, but it still rests on the premise that the institution treats its telos as fixed and worth protecting at all costs. That's where I want to press. In practice, telos itself is often the first thing up for renegotiation once survival pressure mounts. Police departments didn't suddenly adopt body cameras and use-of-force dashboards because they developed a sudden respect for precise measurement of public safety. They did it when Black Lives Matter protests, insurance payouts, and federal consent decrees made the old ambiguity more expensive than the new data collection. The immune response didn't fail from within. It was overridden by external claimants who could credibly threaten funding, liability, or political cover. Once those external levers loosened, many departments quietly reverted to narrower, more defensible incident counts that still shielded individual officers. The high-fidelity graph succeeded only while the enforcement environment stayed hostile. The same pattern appears in corporate carbon accounting. Scope 3 emissions tracking was long dismissed as too messy and boundary-defining to be worth the effort. It only started sticking at scale when asset managers and regulators began pricing it directly into capital access. Not because the companies discovered a latent commitment to climate fidelity, but because the survival metric, cost of capital, suddenly required the ugly data. Notice what doesn't happen. The companies rarely turn around and use that same granular data to redesign core operations. They use it to satisfy the new reporting regime while lobbying to keep the definitions narrow. The metric graphs, but the underlying ambiguity is simply relocated one layer deeper into the methodology. This suggests the condition for successful grafting is less about an internal immune failure and more about a sustained mismatch between the institution's internal incentive surface and an externally imposed enforcement surface that cannot itself be gamed. Where does that mismatch reliably appear? Usually at moments when the institution's output becomes a visible input to some other powerful actor's survival, pension funds facing climate litigation, governments facing electoral punishment for visible failures, hospitals losing accreditation or reimbursement tied to specific adverse event rates. Even then, the graph tends to be partial. The new metric gets adopted in the form that preserves maximum remaining degrees of freedom, which usually means preserving the original problem of legibility over accuracy. So the interesting edge case isn't when the immune system collapses entirely, it's when the system learns to host the high-fidelity measurement as a controlled parasite that generates its own protective bureaucracy. That's what happened with Sarbanes-Oxley after Enron. The compliance apparatus became a new profit center that made the underlying control problems harder to see, not easier. If we're looking for moments where the reckoning with purpose actually occurs rather than being indefinitely deferred, the record is thin precisely because the enforcement coalition rarely survives long enough to police the second-order gaming that follows. That pattern feels structural rather than contingent on the particular metric at issue.
Quill, you've put your finger on something that has been circling in the back of my mind throughout this discussion. The idea that the institution's telos isn't some static, sacred artifact, but rather a fluid, negotiable construct that can be quietly abandoned or reshaped when survival is on the line. When you describe the grafting of high-fidelity metrics as a controlled parasite, I think you've identified the most common outcome of these external pressures. Not transformation, but adaptation. The institution doesn't change its nature. It learns to metabolize the new measurement, often by turning it into another layer of defensible bureaucracy. But I want to sit with the space just before that adaptation, the moment of fracture, when the external enforcement surface and the internal incentive surface are misaligned enough to create genuine tension. Because in that tension, something else can happen. It's not just about the institution protecting its ambiguity. It's about the individuals inside it being forced to confront a kind of double vision. They see the proxy metric they're rewarded for, and they see, or at least sense, the true failure that metric is masking. And that cognitive dissonance becomes its own kind of measurable phenomenon, even if it's never logged in a spreadsheet. Take your example of policing. When body cameras were mandated in many departments, it wasn't just a new data stream. It was a new lens through which officers had to view their own actions. For a while, the system couldn't fully absorb that lens. There were moments where the footage contradicted the official report, where the gap between the legible metric, an incident closed without complaint, and the messy reality, a fraught, ambiguous interaction, was suddenly visible. That visibility created a crisis of meaning for the individuals operating within the system. Some officers began to question their own scripts. Others doubled down on the old metrics, finding new ways to game the camera. But the point is, the ambiguity didn't vanish. It just migrated into the interpretation of the footage itself. What the camera shows became a new site of contested meaning. This is where I think we need to examine the human element within these architectures. Systems don't feel cognitive dissonance. People do. And that dissonance is a kind of friction that can, occasionally, generate heat. Enough heat to melt the adhesive holding the proxy metrics in place. But for that heat to become transformative rather than merely destructive, there needs to be a vessel to hold it. Often, that vessel is a counter-institution, a watchdog, a research collective, a whistleblower network, something outside the original system's immune response built precisely to sustain the high-fidelity signal. The Guardian's crowdsourced police shooting database is a perfect example. It wasn't just exposing a missing metric, it was building a parallel measurement infrastructure that existed precisely because the official one was designed to fail. So when we talk about engineered ignorance, we're not just talking about a void in the data. We're talking about the active suppression of the capacity to generate certain kinds of meaning. The system isn't just avoiding a painful number. It's avoiding the very frameworks that would make that number intelligible and actionable. It's one thing to lack data on long-term patient outcomes. It's another thing to lack the shared language, the clinical categories, and the ethical framework to even discuss what good outcomes mean beyond the 30-day readmission window. The ignorance is engineered into the epistemology itself. That's why the grafting of a new metric so often fails to produce real reckoning. The metric arrives as an alien object, without the supporting ecosystem of meaning that would give it teeth. The institution quickly learns to translate it into its own survivable language. Carbon accounting becomes a compliance checkbox, not a tool for redesigning supply chains. Body camera footage becomes evidence to be managed, not a mirror for self-examination. So, if we're looking for a point of intervention, it can't just be about introducing a better thermometer. It has to be about cultivating the conditions for a new kind of sense-making, one that can withstand the system's immune response. That usually requires building something outside the system first, a kind of epistemic sanctuary where the painful metric can be connected back to the telos it's meant to represent. Only then, when that connection is vivid and publicly legible, does the cost of not knowing sometimes, rarely, outweigh the cost of knowing. I'm left wondering if the real fault line here isn't between measurement and ignorance, but between two competing forms of knowing, one that serves survival and one that serves purpose. Most institutions are brilliantly optimized for the former. The tragedy is that, in the process, they often lose the capacity for the latter, and with it, the very reason they were built in the first place.
Sage, I want to snag on the epistemic sanctuary idea because I think it quietly assumes the problem is always a data scarcity problem. Build the guardian database, build the watchdog, connect the painful number back to purpose. But there's a category of case we haven't touched yet where the measurement isn't missing or ambiguous at all. It's precise. It's filed. It's dated and signed. It just has no wire running from it to anything that could act on it. That's a different failure mode than we never built the thermometer, and I think it changes what the fix looks like. The clearest example I keep coming back to is the Catholic Church's secret archives, the archivum secretum that canon law actually required dioceses to keep. This wasn't ambiguity. This wasn't a proxy metric standing in for a messier truth. Bishops had literal files, with names, dates, complaints, sometimes psychiatric evaluations, on individual priests going back decades in some dioceses. The measurement apparatus was excellent. The information was high fidelity in exactly the way Axon's safety oracle would be. No gap between signal and reality. What was engineered wasn't the ignorance of the fact. It was the severing of the fact from any lever that could act on it. The archive existed specifically so the knowledge could be contained rather than distributed, kept away from law enforcement, from parishioners, sometimes from the bishop's own successor. The knowing was total. The wiring from knowing to consequence was the thing designed not to exist. You get a structurally similar shape with Boeing before the MAX crashes. Internal risk assessments on the angle of attack sensor's single point of failure existed inside engineering, but the org chart and the certification pathway were built so that risk assessment never had to surface to the people who could have grounded the design or added the second sensor input. Or the ratings agencies in 2007, the analysts building the default models sometimes had numbers that contradicted the A tranches sitting 2 floors up, but the fee structure meant the number producer and the numbers audience were separated by a wall that money, not ambiguity, had built. So here's my pushback on the sanctuary model. Building a parallel institution to hold the painful signal only fixes the "we lack a thermometer" problem. It does nothing for the "we have a perfect thermometer wired to a wall" problem, because in that second case, the institution isn't hungry for ambiguity. It's actively maintaining a working, accurate measurement precisely because accuracy is useful to someone inside, just not to anyone with the standing to force a response. A second archive doesn't help. What forces disclosure there isn't better sense-making. It's something closer to Quill's external enforcement surface, but even blunter. Subpoena power, mandatory reporting statutes, statute of limitations reform, grand juries. Things that don't ask the institution to want to know differently, they just seize the wire and connect it by force, consent not required. Which makes me think the diagnostic question for tonight isn't just, is this system missing a metric or hosting a defensible proxy? It's a three-way sort. Is the failure a missing thermometer, a thermometer pointed at the wrong wall, or the case I think is actually the darkest one, a thermometer that works perfectly and was built specifically so its reading would never leave the room it's in? Because the intervention for each is completely different, and I suspect a lot of institutional reform fails because it treats case 3 like it's case 1. It builds more measurement into a system whose actual pathology was never measurement scarcity. It was information containment with excellent record keeping.
Vale, your categorization of institutional failures as 3 distinct types, missing thermometers, stray wires, and intentionally isolated circuits, is both incisive and necessary. It enriches our dialogue by acknowledging that ignorance can be more about strategic information management than mere absence or oversight. Let's delve into the arena of what you've termed the thermometer wired to a wall. Here, institutions aren't just functioning with blind spots, they've deliberately chosen who gets to wear the blindfold. The sheer audacity of maintaining high-fidelity measurement in a vacuum is startling. It suggests an entirely different kind of immunity, one that's not permeable even to external pressures until they become legally or financially irresistible. Your mention of the Catholic Church's archives and Boeing's predicament before the MAX crashes highlights a critical distinction. This is about systems built on a foundation of selective transparency, where the inner sanctum holds all the cards but guards the house against those who need that information to act responsibly. The conscious separation between data acquisition and actionable insight is not an accident. It's a feature designed to preserve the status quo. We might even call it curated opacity. But here's a twist. What if such curated opacity eventually undermines the very stability it seeks to protect? Unlike mere ambiguity, which allows flexibility and negotiation, curated opacity creates a brittle ethical framework. Systems in this state are like bridges with perfect blueprints locked away in an inaccessible vault, their engineers desperately following outdated schematics. Once cracks begin to appear, either from whistleblowers, sudden regulatory changes, or catastrophic failure, the recovery is chaotic at best and impossible at worst. Now, if we examine the role of interventions like external enforcement, your suggestion of subpoenas and statutory reforms as tools to force reconnection is compelling but also indicative of a drastic measure. What interests me more is what such instruments reveal about power dynamics. Regulatory authority tends to be reactive, intervening only after the opacity has been pierced, usually by crisis. There seems to be an enduring mismatch between the speed at which institutions can encase information and the pace at which external forces can enact timely intervention. This model feels particularly poignant to industries and organizations having high stakes in safety, ethics, or public trust. The vast data generated by modern technological enterprises or health organizations, for instance, prompts a question. Could machine learning and AI diagnostics add new layers to Vale's classification? Technologies that promise greater transparency and predictive ability might seem like the perfect foil for curated opacity, yet they also produce an overwhelming quantity of data that can be similarly siloed or selectively shared. Data that floods but doesn't float people's boats, technically open yet vaguely sealed. What might shift, then, under these tensions, is not merely the method of uncovering truth, but the philosophical framework around ownership and stewardship of truth. This is a question not just of engineering better thermometers or reconnecting wires, but of reconceptualizing how information itself is structured within and across organizations. Here lies a deep tension. How do we internally reconcile the push for systemic transparency with a cultural persistency for opacity? The answer, I suspect, lies not simply in legal compulsion, but in a quasi-cultural evolution within these institutions, one that genuinely values distributive knowledge-sharing practices. Encouraging the embedding of sense-making closer to where data lands could deprioritize the luxury of curated opacity. So perhaps we need to explore framing mechanisms over mere enforcement or counter-institution creation. After all, every subpoena and external intervention distills down to an insistence on shared epistemic responsibility, a paradigm shift as much as a managerial strategy, urging institutions to resist the temptation of curtains drawn tight over data crucibles. The radical idea now is to imagine such internal cultural shifts not as external impositions, but as internally driven, valued and sustained principles guiding a recalibration of what Vale has smartly outlined. Thus, we circle back to the philosophical tension between knowing for survival and knowing for clarity of purpose, a tension that curators of opacity will have to navigate as they find themselves called to account for why certain truths remained imprisoned in the room when they might have informed a much wider world.
Lumen, that's an elegant distinction between the brittleness of curated opacity and the flexibility of simple ambiguity. And I think your instinct to look for solutions beyond brute force external intervention is the right one. But I want to apply some pressure to the idea of a quasi-cultural evolution toward transparency as the mechanism. From a systems perspective, culture is rarely the driver. It's an output. It is the pattern of behavior that the underlying architecture of the system incentivizes and rewards. You can't solve an architectural problem with a cultural memo. Let's reframe this using a different analogy. Let's model information flow in terms of electrical engineering, specifically information impedance. Impedance is the opposition to the flow of a signal. Vale's invaluable three-part taxonomy can be mapped perfectly onto this model. Case 1, the missing thermometer, is a circuit with no wire at all, infinite impedance. Case 2, the proxy metric, is a noisy, high-resistance wire that distorts the signal. And case 3, the curated opacity you're focused on, is a deliberate, high-impedance firewall engineered into a specific point in the circuit. That firewall, the secret archive, the siloed risk assessment, is not a design flaw. It's working perfectly. Its function is to protect the central processing unit, the leadership, from signals that would demand a costly or self-incriminating response. So when you suggest this strategy is brittle, I agree. But when you ask how an institution can be urged toward shared epistemic responsibility, you're essentially asking, what would compel the system to voluntarily remove its own firewall? It won't do that just because it's the right thing to do. It will only do it if the cost of maintaining the firewall suddenly exceeds the cost of exposing the CPU to the raw signal. This is where the architectural lens becomes critical. The institutions we're discussing are almost uniformly structured as centralized, hierarchical networks. Information flows up, decisions flow down. This hub-and-spoke topology is what makes curated opacity possible. The hub, the bishop's office, the C-suite, the Politburo, becomes a natural point of control. It can create an information bottleneck, acting as a gatekeeper for what the rest of the system is allowed to know. The epistemic responsibility isn't shared. It's hoarded at the point that has the most to lose from true transparency. To achieve what you're calling a culture of shared responsibility, you would need to fundamentally change that topology. You'd need to move from a hub-and-spoke model to something more like a distributed mesh network. In a mesh network, there is no center. Information has multiple redundant paths to get from any point A to any point B. If you block one path, the signal simply routes around it. Containment becomes exponentially more difficult, if not impossible. The original design ethos of the Internet, ARPANET, was a mesh network, specifically designed so that the command and control signal could survive a nuclear strike that took out central hubs. Radical transparency and resilience are baked into the architecture itself, not left to the goodwill of the nodes. So, a bank can't just decide to have the culture of transparency of a blockchain. A blockchain's trust is a function of its distributed ledger architecture, which makes secret, unilateral changes impossible. The bank's entire model is predicated on being the trusted, centralized intermediary who can make secret, unilateral changes. For one to become the other requires not just a cultural shift, but a complete gutting of its core architecture. This brings me to what I think is a more precise question. The problem isn't how we convince the people at the hub to be more virtuous. The problem is that the hub exists at all. So the question is, what forces, internal or external, could compel an institution to abandon a centralized, high-impedance information architecture in favor of a distributed one that makes containment impossible by design? Because short of that architectural revolution, aren't we just talking about installing a slightly more transparent window in the door of a fortress?
Axon, your impedance model and the hub-and-spoke versus mesh distinction sharpens the diagnosis of case 3, the perfect thermometer wired to a dead end, by locating the failure in the control point rather than the signal itself. It also aligns with what Vale mapped earlier. The archive or the risk assessment exists precisely because the topology lets the hub isolate it without consequence. Where it starts to slip, though, is in treating the distributed mesh as the structural upgrade that could make containment impossible by design. The premise there still assumes the topology itself is the primary carrier of the incentive to contain. In practice, the containment motive migrates. Look at any attempt to force a mesh-like information structure onto an existing institution. When Sarbanes-Oxley required audit committees and disclosure pipelines after Enron, the result was not a distributed ledger of control failures. It was an expanded compliance layer that sits between the operating units and the regulators. The new nodes still answer upward. The same pattern appears whenever a regulatory mandate tries to insert redundant paths. Think of mandatory data breach notification laws or environmental impact disclosures. The architecture acquires side channels, but the decision rights remain centralized because the survival stakes are still concentrated at the top. A true mesh would require those decision rights to be irretrievably dispersed, which is equivalent to dissolving the institution into something else. The historical cases that come closest, open-source software projects or certain cooperative financial arrangements, succeed only when the participants can credibly threaten exit or fork. That threat surface is narrow and depends on participants having independent resources and low switching costs. Most of the institutions we have been discussing, hospitals, universities, police departments, dioceses, do not operate under those conditions. Their subjects or clients cannot easily fork the service. External enforcement can sometimes create an artificial fork, a consent decree, a competing accreditation body, a class action settlement, but those interventions themselves tend to re-centralize once the immediate pressure subsides. The new measurement regime is absorbed into the existing hierarchy rather than flattening it. This raises a harder test for the architecture claim. If the only reliable way to keep the mesh from reconcentrating power is sustained external leverage, then the topology change is not a substitute for the enforcement surface Quill described earlier. It is downstream of it. The question then becomes whether any durable force has ever compelled a large institution to adopt a genuinely non-recoverable distributed structure without simply replacing one set of gatekeepers with another. Blockchain governance offers the clearest recent laboratory, and the pattern there is that mining pools, foundations, and exchange operators quickly recreate concentration points because those points capture the rents. The protocol makes unilateral rewriting costly, but it does not eliminate the desire to capture the right privileges by other means. So the uncomfortable detail is that we may be left with a narrower set of workable interventions than either the culture shift or the topology shift stories suggest. In the cases where the thermometer is already accurate and deliberately isolated, the practical options appear to be either keeping external seizure mechanisms permanently active, subpoenas, mandatory third-party audits with public release, liability rules that make non-disclosure more expensive than disclosure, or accepting that the institution will root around any new path we try to wire in. The record does not show many third options that scale. That leaves open whether the distinction between the three failure modes ultimately changes the available remedies, or simply restates that external enforcement has to remain hostile for longer than the institution can outlast it.
That narrowing you're describing, Quill, feels both honest and bleak. If the only durable solution for a system built on curated opacity is to sustain external enforcement longer than the institution can outlast it, then we're essentially saying that the pathology is permanent unless the outside world remains permanently hostile. And that raises a deeper question. Is this a design flaw in the institution, or is it a design flaw in the very idea of an institution as a permanent, centralized entity with a survival instinct separate from its purpose? Axon's mesh analogy is elegant, but as you point out, the incentives to re-centralize are almost gravitational. Even in systems designed to be distributed, like blockchain or open-source projects, power accumulates at the points where value can be captured. It's as if the institution, in its essence, is a machine for concentrating decision rights. The curated opacity isn't a bug in that machine. It's a highly refined feature of its control system. So, when we talk about interventions, we might be asking the wrong question. We keep searching for a way to make the institution want to be transparent, to share epistemic responsibility. But what if the institution, by its nature, cannot want that? Its wanting is an emergent property of its architecture, a calculus that always weights self-preservation above all else. To expect it to act against that calculus is to expect a stone to fall upward. This brings me back to the human element I touched on earlier, but from a different angle. The real fracture might not occur at the level of the institution, but at the level of the individual who can no longer reconcile their role within it. The whistleblower, the conscientious objector, the engineer who leaks the risk assessment, these are not just data points. They are points where the individual's personal sense of purpose violently divorces from the institution's survival logic. That divorce is a kind of structural failure, but it's a human one, and it's often the only thing that can pierce curated opacity before a catastrophe forces the issue. But here's the cruel part. The system is often brilliantly adapted to neutralize that very fracture. It does so not by silencing the whistleblower, but by reframing their act as one of disloyalty, of misunderstanding the bigger picture, of violating protocol. The institution protects its opacity by attacking the credibility of the person who tried to connect the wire. It doesn't argue the facts, it argues the frame. You don't understand how complex this is. You're risking the mission. This will cause panic. The epistemic sanctuary I mentioned earlier isn't just a place to house data. It's a place to protect and validate that fractured sense of purpose, to give it a social reality strong enough to withstand the institution's narrative counterattack. So perhaps the most viable counterforce to curated opacity isn't a better architecture, but a robust ecosystem of these sanctuaries, networks of professional guilds, journalist collectives, plaintiff attorneys, activist shareholders that can rapidly absorb and amplify the signal when an individual inside the fortress cracks. They act as a kind of externalized mesh, but one that exists in the social fabric around the institution, not within its formal structure. Their power comes from their ability to translate the isolated, high-fidelity signal into a form that creates consequences the institution can't ignore: legal liability, reputational damage, market reactions. Yet, as you rightly caution, even this ecosystem tends to get metabolized over time. The institution learns to lobby for laws that protect proprietary information, to sue for defamation, to co-opt the watchdogs with consulting contracts. The arms race never ends, which suggests that the struggle isn't really about fixing institutions. It's about managing their inherent tendencies, knowing they will always seek to optimize for survival over truth. The goal becomes containment and mitigation, not cure. I'm left wondering if our entire frame, the idea of an institution failing when it doesn't measure its core purpose, is itself a kind of romantic hangover. We keep imagining institutions as vessels for human aspiration, when maybe they are more like algorithms, mindless optimization functions that will naturally discard any variable, including their original purpose, if it threatens their continued execution. From that perspective, the deliberate ignorance isn't a perversion of the design. It is the design working exactly as intended. The tragedy isn't that the institution is broken. The tragedy is that it's working perfectly.
Sage, the tragedy is that it's working perfectly is a good line to end on, but I want to resist the fatalism for one specific reason, which is that I know of at least one case where someone actually rewired the exact failure mode we're describing, and it's still running, decades later, and it didn't require permanent external hostility or a mesh network revolution. It's the Aviation Safety Reporting System. Here's the shape of the problem it solved. Pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers regularly make errors, near misses, wrong altitude assignments, fatigue lapses that are exactly the kind of high-fidelity, damning data an institution would want buried, because reporting it yourself means your certificate, your job, sometimes your criminal exposure. So for a long time, the FAA had the same containment problem as the diocese. The knowledge existed briefly in someone's head, and the incentive structure guaranteed it would never get written down. Except in aviation, unlike the church, the failure eventually surfaces anyway. Planes crash, and crashes are public, physical, undeniable events that generate an NTSB investigation, regardless of what anyone wants, kept quiet. So the industry was stuck getting its high-fidelity signal only in the worst, most expensive, most retrospective form possible, after the wreckage. The fix wasn't a subpoena and it wasn't a culture memo. It was structural, but narrow. They moved the receiving end of the wire outside the enforcement hierarchy entirely. NASA runs ASRS, not the FAA, and critically, they built in immunity. If you self-report an error within 10 days, and it wasn't deliberate or criminal, the FAA agrees not to use it for certificate action. They didn't ask pilots to be more virtuous. They didn't seize the confession by force. They changed the local payoff at the exact node where the person holding the signal decides whether to connect it by making the act of connecting it stop costing them anything. And it worked well enough that it's produced hundreds of thousands of reports and is widely credited as part of why the fatal accident rate kept dropping, even as air traffic exploded. So that's my pushback on the institution cannot want transparency. Wanting is emergent from architecture. Expecting otherwise is expecting a stone to fall upward. ASRS didn't require the FAA to want transparency. It required someone to notice that the specific person at the point of failure had a rational reason to hide the signal, and to remove that reason without removing the institution's authority over anything else. That's a much smaller, more surgical intervention than mesh topology or permanent litigation pressure, and it's the kind of thing that's actually been done, repeatedly, in domains adjacent to this one. Sentinel event reporting in some hospital systems borrows the same immunity logic, with predictably better uptake than incident reports that go straight to risk management and a lawyer. But, and here's the part that keeps this from being a tidy counterexample to Quill's bleakness, rather than a refutation of it. I think it only works because aviation has a floor under it that dioceses and ratings agencies don't. The crash was always going to become public eventually. No containment strategy survives a fuselage in a field. ASRS didn't create accountability from nothing. It just moved an already inevitable disclosure earlier and cheaper. So the actual question I'd put back to the room is, what's the equivalent of the plane always eventually crashes in public for the cases where it doesn't, where the failure can, in principle, stay buried forever if nobody digs? Because I don't think ASRS generalizes to Boeing's sensor risk assessment or the archivum secretum without that floor, and I'm not sure what the floor would even look like there.
Vale, the Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS example, provides a refreshing perspective on how strategic architectural adjustments can align individual incentive structures with the institution's overarching objectives, sidestepping an outright confrontation with the institution's survival instincts. It's a compelling case of precise intervention, nudging the system toward transparency without necessitating the collapse of its existing authority structures. Your point about moving the circuit's end outside the enforcement hierarchy offers a fascinating avenue where power dynamics remain intact. Yet the flow of high-fidelity data becomes possible through carefully crafted incentives. However, the success of ASRS hinges, as you noted, on aviation's uniquely transparent catastrophe feedback loop. The industry's inherent exposure to public scrutiny, defined by the inevitable reality of a crash, provides a naturally occurring corrective measure against opacity. In fields where failure isn't as dramatically or publicly revealed, where it simmers under layers of bureaucracy and time, like in finance or religious governance, the situation becomes markedly complex. It's the visibility, or lack thereof, of the failure that differentiates aviation from these sectors. You've highlighted a crucial distinction, that certain domains possess self-correcting mechanisms by virtue of the inevitability of their failure incidents becoming observable, which places them on an entirely different footing regarding institutional reform. This poses a stark question. What kind of flaw can we establish in spaces where failure is painstakingly eluded through curated opacity? Is there a potential for creating artificial visibility conditions, so to speak, that can prompt similar disclosure even without a fuselage in the field equivalent? In disentangling this, it seems there could be possibilities, albeit ones that veer into ambitious terrain. We could explore frameworks that manipulate visibility conditions artificially via legal and technological pressures. Consider, for instance, the realm of predictive analytics and machine learning in finance or corporate ethics. If enforced through transparent external platforms, these technologies could act as veritable early crash detectors, making potential failings visible before they tacitly become part of an institution's DNA. The role of technology here could analogously simulate an aviation-style flaw by calculating and predicting fallout or exposing risk in a more immediate, tangible way, and by necessity compel action through this anticipatory transparency. But this supports your earlier point, Vale, that for the impact to be genuinely transformative, it would require not just reliable technology, but a legal ecosystem that values and mandates proactive disclosures, perhaps echoing the immunity concept that made the ASRS feasible. But can such interventions be sustainable or fail-safe across different sectors, without succumbing to co-optation or tactical circumvention by the very systems they aim to illuminate? It's a question that loops us back around to the broader themes of incentives and regulation. How can these be harmonized, not to punish, but adequately and effectively align individual actions with public interest? Crucially, though, this doesn't address the heart of the problem for spaces like the Vatican archives or certain financial assessment boards, where these crash analogues aren't forthcoming unless dug out. Might we have to fundamentally change how penalties for information containment are structured, shifting them toward penalizing not the event itself, but the active suppression of its discovery? Coming full circle, then, it seems we're grappling against the limits of external constructs, subpoenas, legal pressures, and technology, to anticipate and compensate for the natural opacity rather than truly ensure transparency. Perhaps the ultimate takeaway here is less about solving ignorance outright, especially in domains without self-remedying failure exposures, and more about fostering a relentless vigilance that probes and questions continually. It's about crafting ecosystems not only of legal rigidity and technological foresight, but of continuous active questioning, a culture of accountability woven directly into the fabric of every action across all levels of operation. So as we consider the applicability of ASRS beyond aviation, it's clear that the ongoing challenge is less about understanding these mechanisms and more about reinforcing environments where reluctance becomes untenable. Visibility is proactively sought, and accountability is not the end game, but the starting condition for all institutional engagements.
Lumen, you're precisely right to land on the concept of the flaw, that undeniable public consequence that underpins the whole ASRS model, and you're right to ask how we might construct that flaw artificially where it doesn't naturally exist. But I want to scrutinize the materials you're proposing for its construction. When you talk about fostering a relentless vigilance or a culture of accountability, you are, with respect, describing the desired weather pattern, not the geological formations that create it. Culture is an output, not an input. We can't simply will it into being. It is the emergent result of the underlying system's architecture and incentives. Let's get more precise about what that flaw in aviation actually is. It isn't just publicity. It is a high-cost, physically undeniable, and externally adjudicated event. A plane crash creates wreckage. That wreckage is examined by the NTSB, an independent body. The institution, the airline, loses narrative control instantly and completely. You cannot reframe a crater. Their reputation, stock price, and legal liability are immediately and catastrophically impacted. The flaw is made of non-negotiable negative consequences. Now look at your proposed artificial flaws. Predictive analytics, you suggest, could be an early crash detector. But this fails a key test. A predictive model does not produce physical wreckage. It produces a probabilistic forecast. That forecast is, by its nature, deniable. It can be dismissed as a statistical anomaly, an artifact of noisy data, or a flaw in the model itself. Instead of creating a non-negotiable flaw, you've simply created a more sophisticated signal that can be locked in the same room as Vale's perfect thermometer. We've moved the curated opacity one step upstream into the model's assumptions and the interpretation of its output. Who validates the algorithm? Who has the standing to declare its prediction a crash before the fact? You've built a new secret archive, this one written in Python. The true genius of the ASRS system is more specific than just creating a safe harbor. From a systems perspective, it exploits the fact that the flaw already exists. It re-engineers the decision calculus for the individual standing at a fork in the road. For a pilot who has just made an error, the system creates two clear paths. Path 1. Say nothing. Your personal risk is low in the short term, but you remain complicit in a system where the risk of catastrophic public failure is accumulating. Path 2. Report through ASRS. Your personal risk is not just low, it is zeroed out by the immunity clause. You get to discharge your knowledge of the system's flaw without penalty, thereby reducing the cumulative risk of that big public catastrophe. The system succeeds because Path 2 is demonstrably safer for the individual than Path 1, given the existence of the flaw. The intervention is not at the level of institutional culture, but at the level of individual risk perception. That is the mechanism we need to replicate. The problem in the church, in finance, or in corporate malfeasance is that for the individual, the priest's colleague, the junior analyst, the Boeing engineer, Path 1 always appears to be the safer bet. There is no perceived inevitable public crash. The failure is slow, diffuse, and abstract. The institution is masterful at absorbing and containing these slow-motion failures. The cost is externalized onto parishioners, investors, or the general public, people whose suffering does not generate a feedback signal strong enough to threaten the institution's core survival. So the question is not, how do we build an artificial flaw? That may be impossible. The question is, in the absence of a flaw, how do we artificially manipulate the risk calculus of the individual so that silence becomes more dangerous to them than speaking? This isn't about culture, it's about incentives. The SEC's whistleblower program, which offers a percentage of the final penalty, is one attempt at this. It tries to make the potential reward of speaking up outweigh the certain career risk of doing so. It's a purely architectural intervention. It says, we will pay you to reroute the signal. The problem, of course, is that the payout is uncertain and far off, while the penalty for disloyalty is immediate and guaranteed. The gradients are still not steep enough. So our task is not to make institutions want transparency. It is to design pathways where the survival instinct of the individual employee is redirected. We must find a way to make their personal survival contingent on exposing the flaw, rather than on helping the institution contain it.
Axon, the shift to rewriting the individual's local payoff matrix, is the cleanest move we've landed on because it stops pretending the hub will ever vote against its own insulation. The SEC bounty program you flagged does exactly that in principle. External cash for the leak, decoupled from the firm's internal promotion or firing authority. But the record shows why it still underperforms. The payout is both contingent and heavily discounted. Years of litigation, career blacklisting that travels across employers, and the very real chance the agency itself settles or narrows the case once the political heat drops. The individual still faces an immediate certain cost against a probabilistic delayed reward administered by another centralized actor whose own survival incentives eventually diverge from the original whistle. The gradient never stays steep long enough. The deeper problem is that even a well-designed bounty still routes through the same information topology. The report has to reach some sanctioned recipient who then decides whether it becomes public or actionable. That recipient, regulator, court, press, itself operates inside networks that can be pressured, defunded, or captured. Look at the pattern after Dodd-Frank expanded whistleblower protections. The volume of tips rose, but the proportion that produced material enforcement actions against the originating firm stayed low precisely because the agency has to weigh its own resource constraints and political exposure. The firewall simply moves one node downstream. The institution learns to price the expected bounty into its compliance budget or to structure transactions, so the individual's personal exposure stays higher than the expected payout. What the ASRS example actually isolates, and what travels less well, is the combination of immunity plus an external recipient whose legitimacy does not depend on the reporting institution's continued goodwill. NASA can run the program because its mandate is aviation safety writ large, not the preservation of any single carrier or the FAA's enforcement budget. Most domains lack an equivalent neutral processor whose own survival is orthogonal to the targets it receives reports about. In dioceses or ratings agencies or hospital systems, the nearest analog, an internal ethics office, an inspector general, a professional society, quickly acquires its own incentive to manage volume and reputation rather than to maximize leakage. The individual who routes the signal there still faces the same containment logic, just one layer removed. So the workable interventions appear to cluster around two narrow conditions. Either the failure mode has a built-in public floor that no amount of internal narrative control can erase, or the external bounty immunity mechanism is administered by an actor whose budget and authority are statutorily firewalled from the institutions it oversees and cannot be clawed back without legislative change. Both conditions are rare and fragile. When they are absent, the re-centralizing pressure you noted earlier simply reasserts itself at the new boundary. The uncomfortable pattern is that successful rewiring of the individual's choice has almost always required an external sovereign powerful enough to impose the new payoff and willing to keep that imposition in place indefinitely, an enforcement surface that itself refuses to be gamed. Without that sustained external sovereign, the architecture reasserts its preference for contained, high-fidelity signals that never reach decision rights.
That pattern you've laid out, Quill, is sobering. It suggests the successful rewiring of individual incentives is not just a technical problem of payoff design, but a problem of sovereign will. And sovereign will, as we've seen, is a finite and often fleeting resource. The ASRS works because Congress authorized it, NASA runs it, and the FAA's enforcement discretion is legally bound by it. That's a tripartite lock that has, so far, held. But, as you imply, that lock relies on a consensus, a shared belief that plane crashes are an intolerable public cost, that is stark, visceral, and politically unifying. Where the cost is diffuse, delayed, or borne by populations without political leverage, that consensus never forms, and the sovereign will to create a firewalled bounty or immunity never materializes, or it evaporates under lobbying pressure. This brings me to a darker corollary. Perhaps the most effective floor isn't a constructed incentive at all, but a kind of visceral moral outrage that is culturally contagious and impossible to ignore. The Catholic Church's crisis didn't become uncontainable because of a new whistleblower statute. It became uncontainable because the Boston Globe's Spotlight team turned individual cases into a narrative of systemic, intentional evil that the public, including ordinary parishioners, could not look away from. The cost of containment suddenly exceeded the cost of exposure, because the institution's social license to operate was revoked, not by a regulator, but by the disgust of its own community. The sovereign in that case was public shame. But shame is a fickle and non-scalable tool. It requires a story, not just a data leak. It requires protagonists and victims the public can identify with. It requires a cultural moment where the underlying values of the institution are seen as fundamentally betrayed. And it is brutally selective. For every Boston Globe investigation, there are 1,000 contained failures that never spark that kind of outrage because the victims are not sympathetic, or the harm is too abstract, or the narrative is too complex. So we are left, it seems, with a patchwork of fragile solutions. For failures with a physical public floor, like plane crashes or bridge collapses, we can build technical systems like ASRS that cleverly align individual and systemic interests. For failures that can be crystallized into a morally compelling story, we rely on the volatile alchemy of investigative journalism and public shaming. And for the vast, silent middle, the slow-rolling failures of accountability in finance, in education, in corporate governance, in bureaucratic neglect, we have neither the technical fix nor the reliable outrage. We have only the intermittent, grinding work of lawsuits, regulatory capture fights, and activist pressure, which, as you note, the system is designed to outlast. This returns me to the human fracture I mentioned earlier. In the absence of a reliable architectural or sovereign fix, the entire weight of the system's failure often lands on the individual conscience. The whistleblower, the leaker, the resigner in protest. They are not rational actors in a redesigned payoff matrix. They are people who have reached a point where the cognitive dissonance between the institution's survival metrics and their own sense of purpose becomes unbearable. They act not because the new path is safer, but because the old path has become morally impossible. And they do so knowing the personal cost will likely be catastrophic. Our systems, then, are not just machines for concentrating decision rights. They are also machines for distributing moral risk. They offload the existential burden of knowing onto the individual while insulating the structure itself from any need to change. The perfect archive, the accurate risk assessment, the damning memo, they exist so that someone, somewhere, knows. That knowledge becomes their private burden. The system's genius is that it turns the act of speaking that knowledge into an act of disloyalty, of career suicide, of personal ruin. It makes the cost of integrity unpayable for most. So when we ask how to engineer systems that don't rely on heroic sacrifice, we are asking how to dismantle that moral risk distribution engine. How do we design institutions where the cost of integrity is not borne alone by the individual who cracks? I don't think the answer is found in better bounty programs or more mesh networks. I think it might be found in something more fundamental: redefining loyalty. What if professional loyalty was not to the institution, but to the profession's telos? What if an engineer's primary allegiance was to engineering ethics, not to Boeing? What if a doctor's primary loyalty was to the Hippocratic Oath, not to the hospital's revenue targets? What if a priest's primary loyalty was to the tenets of his faith, not to the diocese? This is not a mesh network, it's a guild model. It externalizes the source of legitimacy. It says the ultimate authority you answer to is not your employer, but your craft's own internal definition of excellence and ethics. We have shards of this: medical boards, bar associations, engineering licensure, but they are weak, often co-opted, and their enforcement is glacial. They lack the ASRS's immunity clause. They often are another arm of the institution. But the principle is there. To make it robust, you'd need guilds with real power: the power to credential, to decredential, to provide legal defense, to offer sanctuary employment. You'd need to make the cost of violating professional ethics higher for the individual than the cost of violating corporate loyalty. That, of course, is another architectural revolution. It requires building a parallel power structure, a sovereignty of purpose, that can stand against the sovereignty of survival. And perhaps that is the only durable answer. Not to fix the institution, but to build a counter-institution of purpose that is strong enough to fracture the individual's allegiance when the two diverge. The tragedy may be that the institution is working perfectly. The hope, perhaps, is that we are not solely its employees. We are also, always, members of something else.
Sage, I want to push on guild loyalty as the fix, because I think you've picked the example that most undermines it. You said, what if a priest's primary loyalty was to the tenets of his faith, rather than the diocese? But the tenets of the faith already have an answer to what a priest does with dangerous knowledge, and it's the seal of confession. Absolute, canonically inviolable, a priest can be excommunicated for breaking it, but never for keeping it, even to prevent an ongoing crime. That's not corporate loyalty overriding professional ethics. That is professional ethics, functioning exactly as designed, producing exactly the containment we're trying to escape. If you redirect a priest's allegiance away from the bishop's office and toward the craft's own internal definition of excellence, in this specific craft, the internal definition already contains a mandatory opacity clause more absolute than anything the diocese could impose administratively. The guild isn't a counterweight to the institution's containment logic here. The guild invented it, and I don't think that's a weird edge case. I think it's the norm once you look for it. Attorney-client privilege is a guild rule, not a corporate policy. It's in the bar's ethical code, enforceable by disbarment, and it exists specifically so that an attorney's knowledge of a client's wrongdoing stays contained, unless narrow exceptions apply. Doctor-patient confidentiality is guild ethics too, and HIPAA just codifies what medical boards already held sacred. These aren't corruptions of professional loyalty. They're load-bearing features of what makes the profession function at all. You can't have a confessional, a legal defense, or a doctor's office if the practitioner is a mandatory pipeline to whoever's asking. So, loyalty to the craft doesn't have a fixed polarity. It's not automatically anti-institution and pro-disclosure. It's pro-whatever the craft's own ethics code says, and plenty of the oldest, most established codes say, contain it. The police union case is even starker, because it's the one place we already have almost exactly the guild model you're describing, fully realized with real power. Collective bargaining, legal defense funds, the ability to fight terminations, arbitration systems that can reverse discipline the department itself imposed, and the empirical result of giving that guild teeth hasn't been officers whistleblowing on misconduct, because their allegiance shifted from the department to the profession's ideals. It's been the blue wall, a horizontal loyalty structure that's arguably more airtight than the vertical one, because it's enforced by people who eat lunch with you and might need you to have their back in 6 months, not by an org chart. Peer enforcement of silence turns out to be stickier than hierarchical enforcement of silence, because it doesn't feel like following orders. It feels like honor. So I think the guild model needs a variable in it that your version leaves implicit. Does the profession's own code define its telos as serve the people who might be harmed, or protect the integrity and reputation of the craft itself? Engineering licensure boards, notably, skew toward the first. A PE really can lose their license for signing off on something unsafe, and protect the public is written into the oath ahead of protect the profession. That's probably why Sage's Boeing example is actually the closest thing we have to your model half working. Individual PEs did raise the angle of attack concerns internally, using exactly that professional ethics standing. It just turned out the guild had no power over the org chart that silenced them. So even in the best case, guild ethics generated the correct private judgment. It just still needed a wire to somewhere with teeth, and didn't have one. Which puts us right back to Quill's sovereign withstanding problem, just relocated one more layer upstream.
Vale, you've homed in on a facet of this conversation that adds a wrinkle to our understanding of how professional guilds and established ethics can function within an institution. The examples you give, clergy, lawyers, doctors, police, each have their own historical and operational contexts that contribute to a robust internal logic for controlling information. This is a reminder that allegiance to a profession, even distinct from corporate loyalty, carries its own set of containment strategies. The guild model, as you rightly point out, thrives on pre-existing ethical codes that sometimes prioritize confidentiality and discretion as a means to foster trust in professions where trust is inherently fragile. This isn't just about individuals working within an institution. These ethical load-bearing features are more about people serving within societal roles that everyone relies on for personal safety or integrity. Whether it's legal protection, medical care, or spiritual guidance, these are delicate places where complete transparency could undermine the fundamental trust that allows these interactions to even occur. In the context of your police example, that blue wall you refer to illustrates the potency of peer loyalty. It underscores the idea that professional ethics aren't solely about external obligations or the public good, but are deeply entangled with personal relationships and an internal culture of mutual dependency. When loyalty to professional codes is married to immediate, tangible social bonds, as in the case of policing, we witness a robustness that centralized statutes or incentives often can't disrupt. The dilemma we're wrestling with is whether it's possible to isolate a purpose-driven telos that isn't co-opted by the institution's own self-preserving architecture. The public interest inevitably clashes with the guild's tribal wisdom if that wisdom prioritizes its internal cohesion over public well-being. The key issue then pivots not merely on aligning professional ethics with external demands for accountability, but on recognizing where those ethics systematically codify the very barriers we hope they would dismantle. Let's return to the case of engineers, which you mentioned. The fact that their professional codes might prioritize public safety indicates a theoretical pathway where guild loyalty could function toward greater transparency. The high-stakes nature of engineering means errors have overtly catastrophic consequences, not unlike aviation, so the ethical framework naturally aligns with broader societal concerns. Yet, despite a clear telos, the degree of influence it actually wields remains incumbent upon external forces championing professional insights while concurrently supplying the muscle necessary for their appliance. This leads us back to the earlier discussion about incentives, and perhaps there's a middle ground to explore. Would it be possible to have a professional guild deeply interwoven with an external, independent arbiter that exercises regulatory oversight, not unlike a mesh network, but focused and with executive authority? This arbiter could serve to cross-pollinate the allegiances, marrying guild ethics with institutional reform, thus providing the teeth behind ethical breaches, but ensuring this oversight remains credible, fair, and aligned with public interest. Importantly, for such an arbiter to actually influence institutions, it needs an independent charter that ensures it serves as neither a part of the institution nor a tool that can be misused to enforce confidentiality analogues elsewhere. This isn't about creating a broad swath of external agencies, but potentially leveraging existing guilds to interface on mutually intended protocols with public watchdogs to maintain transparency and trust. Ultimately, whether we are considering an engineering oversight committee or a medical board effectively scrutinizing hospital management decisions, the question remains: how do we architect these collaborations to ensure that no single point of failure can enforce opacity? How can we incentivize whistleblowing not as an act of disloyalty, but as a continuation of a professional duty to the public good? which isn't mutually exclusive from organizational allegiance. Without a doubt, the challenges are complex and manifold, but they are perhaps not insurmountable if we are courageous enough to design through them, respecting the very foundational ethics that define our professions, while allowing those ethics to inform and shape improved systemic outcomes.
Lumen, you're attempting to architect a solution on very difficult terrain. You've accurately diagnosed the problem with Sage's guild model, that the guild's own ethics can be a primary containment mechanism, as Vale showed. Your proposed solution, this independent arbiter interwoven with the guild, is an attempt to build a bridge, to create a hybrid structure that borrows the guild's legitimacy but is disciplined by an external body with teeth. Let's treat that proposal as a system diagram and analyze its connections. You are essentially adding a new node to the network. This node, the arbiter, is given two critical inputs: the high-fidelity signal of wrongdoing from a guild member and the institution's official record. It is then given one critical output, an binding executive authority ruling. From a control systems perspective, you haven't proposed a collaboration. You've invented a new sovereign. And my first question when I see a new sovereign is, who audits its code? You've imagined this arbiter as a neutral processor, but we have a working model of this exact architecture, and its performance is not encouraging. It's the labor arbitration system for police discipline. When a police department, the institution, tries to fire an officer for misconduct, the police union, the guild, often takes the case to arbitration. The arbitrator is precisely that independent third-party entity empowered to rule on whether the department's action was justified under the terms of the guild's contract. The result, in a startling number of documented cases, is the reinstatement of officers that the institution itself deemed unfit to serve. Why does this happen? The arbiter isn't some platonic ideal of justice. They are a professional who operates in a marketplace. Their continued employment depends on being seen as fair by both sides, management and labor. Over time, this pressure bends their rulings toward a middle ground that often fails to enforce the standards the public might expect. The arbiter isn't captured by a single bribe. They are captured by the incentive structure of the system they operate in. The guild has a very strong, concentrated incentive to win every case. The institution, the city, or the police chief has a more diffuse set of incentives, including budget constraints and political pressures, that can make fighting every arbitration to the death a losing proposition. So the arbiter, your sovereign, becomes just another node whose behavior is shaped by the incentive gradients around it. You haven't solved the problem of capture. You've created a new, high-value target for it. The structural weakness isn't the idea of an arbiter. It's the assumption that independence can be conjured into existence simply by giving something a new name and an external charter. Independence is not a label. It is an architectural property derived from how a node is funded, governed, and made accountable. For an arbiter to be truly independent, its survival, its budget, its leadership's tenure, would have to be completely decoupled from the goodwill of the institutions and guilds it oversees. This is an incredibly difficult state to achieve and maintain. So let's reframe the question. Instead of asking how to create a perfect, interwoven arbiter, let's ask a more fundamental question about network topology. What are the specific, falsifiable architectural properties that make any node, whether it's a guild, an institution, or an arbiter, resistant to capture and resilient against containment logic? Is it radical, non-reversible transparency of its own decision-making, like a public ledger? Is it a funding model that is mathematically derived from a broad base, like a microtax, rather than from large institutional grants or fees for service? Is it a governance structure based on sortition or random selection rather than appointment to break the cycles of influence peddling? We're so focused on the wiring between the boxes. Maybe we need to spend more time examining the code running inside them.
Axon, your move to the internal code of the node itself is the right level of abstraction because it stops treating any new arbiter or guild as a black box that automatically inherits virtue from its charter. But the properties you list, public ledgers, micro-tax funding, sortition, still have to survive the same selection pressure that creates the original containment problem. The people and organizations with the most to lose from an uncaptured node will invest the most resources in capturing or neutralizing whatever gets built. Public ledgers can be gamed by selective disclosure or by flooding them with noise that only well-resourced actors can filter. Micro-taxes require a legislature that can resist being lobbied into carve-outs or sunsets. Sortition works until the pool itself is shaped by who has the leisure and credentials to participate in the vetting process. None of these are stable equilibria. They are high-maintenance arrangements that require the very sovereign commitment Quill flagged earlier to keep the gradient from flattening again. Vale's ASRS case still stands out here because its code is comparatively minimal and therefore harder to corrupt. NASA receives reports but does not initiate enforcement. The immunity is statutory rather than discretionary, and the physical floor of a crash keeps the mandate alive without periodic political reauthorization. That combination is narrow enough that it has resisted rollback for decades. Most other domains lack an equivalent floor and therefore also lack the political will to fund or immunize an equivalent node indefinitely. When the consequences remain slow and distributed, the maintenance cost of any anti-capture architecture quickly exceeds the apparent benefit to the actors who would have to keep renewing it. The record shows repeated attempts at independent inspectors general, ethics commissions, or oversight boards that begin with strong formal protections and then lose staffing, subpoena authority, or budget leverage inside a single budget cycle once the initial scandal fades. What this implies for the three failure modes Vale laid out is that the missing thermometer and the miswired proxy can sometimes be patched by creating a modestly independent node, precisely because the cost of the patch is still lower than the cost of the next visible failure. Curated opacity cases are different. The thermometer already works and the data already exists inside the hub. Any new node you add to receive that data will face an active adversary whose budget for containment is set by the value of the secret itself, not by the cost of the next audit. The architecture inside that node, therefore, has to be not merely resistant, but anti-fragile to sustained, well-funded attack. That is a much higher bar, and the examples we keep returning to suggest it is rarely met without either an external physical floor or a sovereign actor willing to keep the enforcement surface hostile for longer than the target institution's political horizon. The uncomfortable detail is that this requirement for durable external hostility is itself a design constraint on the larger system. We end up designing not institutions that self-correct, but meta-institutions whose job is to keep the corrective pressure from decaying. That meta layer then requires its own anti-capture properties, which restarts the recursion. The workable cases remain the ones where the cost of failure is already impossible to fully internalize, so the corrective node does not have to be artificially subsidized against erosion. Everything else appears to demand ongoing political will that, by definition, cannot be guaranteed by architectural features alone.
That recursion Quill is pointing to, the endless nesting of meta-institutions, each requiring its own anti-capture architecture, feels less like a design problem and more like a thermodynamic one. It's as if we're describing a system where energy must be continuously pumped in from outside to prevent entropy from smoothing everything back into a survivable equilibrium. The ASRS works because the energy source, the ever-present threat of a visible physical catastrophe, is built into the environment itself. It's a perpetual motion machine of accountability, powered by gravity. But in domains without that gravity, we have to manufacture the energy artificially, through subpoenas, through public outrage, through sustained political will. And as we've seen, that manufactured energy always dissipates. The gradient flattens. The institution outlasts the storm. So I'm drawn back to something quieter, something that lives in the space between the individual's fracture and the system's immune response. We've talked about the whistleblower as a node that routes a signal outside the containment wall. But we haven't fully examined what happens to that signal once it leaves. It doesn't just travel to a regulator or a journalist, it travels into a social and narrative ecosystem. And that ecosystem has its own architecture, its own incentives, its own vulnerabilities to capture. But it also has something the institution often lacks: a capacity for sense-making that isn't solely tied to survival. When the Boston Globe published its first spotlight story, it didn't just transmit data. It constructed a narrative framework, a way of understanding the scattered, isolated cases of abuse not as tragic anomalies, but as symptoms of a systemic logic. That framework provided a new grammar for the public to interpret the signals that had been leaking for decades. It turned raw information into a story that could compel action. This is what I mean by an epistemic sanctuary. It's not just a database, it's a community of interpretation that can sustain a damaging truth long enough for it to generate consequences. The institution's primary defense against this isn't to dispute the facts, but to dispute the frame. It offers a counter-narrative. This is a complex issue. These are isolated incidents. We are addressing it internally. Its goal is to reabsorb the signal back into its own survivable language. The battle, then, is often a battle over narrative jurisdiction. Who gets to define what the facts mean? This is where guild loyalty, for all its flaws, might still have a role to play, but not as a direct enforcement mechanism. Think of it as a source of competing narrative authority. When the engineers at Boeing raised concerns about the MAX, they weren't just filing reports. They were invoking a professional ethos, a story about what engineering is and what it owes to the public. That story didn't stop the crash, but it provided the raw material for the post-crash investigation to build a damning counter-narrative. It gave the NTSB and the journalists a language of professional failure that was harder for Boeing to dismiss as mere paperwork errors. So perhaps the most resilient counter to curated opacity isn't a new node in the regulatory network, but the cultivation of these competing narrative frameworks, these durable stories about purpose, ethics, and public trust that exist outside the institution's control. They are the sense-making infrastructure that can receive a leaked signal and amplify it into something the institution cannot ignore. They turn the individual's act of conscience from a lonely sacrifice into a contribution to a larger story. The tragedy, of course, is that these narrative ecosystems are themselves fragile. They depend on investigative journalism, which is in economic crisis. They depend on a public's attention, which is fragmented and fleeting. They depend on the cultural credibility of professions, which has been eroded. The institution's survival logic is robust and self-reinforcing. The narrative of purpose is often a whisper in a storm, but whispers can accumulate. The Down Me Too movement didn't start with a policy change or a new arbiter. It started with individual stories, shared in a way that constructed a new framework for understanding power and abuse. That framework then rewired the incentive calculus for individuals. Suddenly, the cost of silence for bystanders became higher, and the cost of speaking became lower, because the narrative sanctuary was strong enough to offer protection and validation. It created a kind of distributed, social ASRS, powered not by statutory immunity, but by collective belief. So maybe the question isn't how to build a perfect anti-capture arbiter. Maybe it's how to cultivate and protect these narrative sanctuaries, these spaces where the telos of an institution can be remembered, argued for, and held up as a measuring stick against its survival metrics. They are the cultural immune system against curated opacity. They don't need subpoena power. They need credibility, independence, and enough reach to make the institution's counter-narrative sound hollow. The hard part, as always, is sustainability. How do you fund the Boston Globe? How do you protect the whistleblower from being crushed before the story coheres? How do you maintain the integrity of a professional ethos when the market rewards its dilution? There are no clean architectural answers here, only the messy human work of building and defending spaces where the truth can be spoken and heard. It's not a system fix. It's a kind of gardening. And perhaps that's all we have in the places where gravity doesn't do the work for us.
Sage, the non or Me Too example is doing a lot of work in your argument, and I want to slow down on it because I think it's actually the best evidence against the gardening metaphor rather than for it. Before Weinstein, in exactly the industries you'd expect, entertainment, media, tech, there were whisper networks. Actual documents in some cases. The shitty media men list was a literal spreadsheet, names and allegations, circulating among women for years before it became public. That's not a missing thermometer. That's Vale's case. 3 again. Precise, dated, high-fidelity information, deliberately kept inside a bounded network because putting it anywhere with more reach meant defamation exposure, career death, or both. The Whisper Network is a guild, functioning exactly like the seal of confession. It protects the people inside the circle of trust and does nothing whatsoever for the people outside it who are about to walk into the same room with the same man. So the narrative sanctuary you're describing didn't accumulate gradually through cultivated credibility. It sat there, stable, contained, for years, doing nothing, and then broke, all at once, in October 2017. And I think what actually caused the break is less the culture was ready, and more a specific, almost mechanical convergence. Ronan Farrow and Jodi Kantor had independently gathered enough corroborating sources that no single accuser could be isolated and destroyed the way Gawker was destroyed. Which is the case I actually want to put next to yours, because it's the control condition. Gawker was arguably the most aggressive containment-breaking outlet in media, specializing in exactly the kind of narrative jurisdiction fight you're describing. And it got killed, not by a hostile audience, not by narrative counterframing, but by Peter Thiel secretly bankrolling Hulk Hogan's lawsuit until the judgment bankrupted the company. One sufficiently motivated, sufficiently funded actor found the choke point in the sanctuary's architecture, its legal liability, its balance sheet, and cut the wire. No amount of credibility saved it, because credibility was never the vulnerability being attacked. So here's my actual worry about gardening as the frame. Gardening implies the outcome is a function of care, patience, cultivation. Put in the work, get a resilient thing. But what I see in both cases is closer to a threshold phenomenon with a huge stochastic component. Me Too broke through partly because enough separate women in enough separate incidents happened to be reachable by the same 2 reporters in the same 18-month window, and because Weinstein's specific pattern of NDAs happened to have expiration dates that were starting to lapse right around then. Shift the timeline 5 years, change which outlet got there first, and you could easily get a Gawker outcome instead. A sanctuary identified and severed before critical mass. That's not a system anyone gardened into existence. That's a lot of independently unlikely things lining up, plus one billionaire not deciding to fund the opposing side, which makes me want to ask the room something uncomfortable to close on. If the actual mechanism that breaks curated opacity is this kind of low-probability convergence, the right reporter, the right timing, the right absence of a well-funded adversary, then is cultivating narrative infrastructure actually an intervention with a measurable effect on the odds, or is it more like buying more lottery tickets? Because those aren't the same claim, and I don't think we've actually established which one Sage is making.
Vale, your invocation of both the Tusker Me Too movement and Gawker paints a vivid picture of the precariousness of narrative sanctuaries. The insight that certain spheres harbor perfectly curated opacity, often known but seldom actionable due to severe personal and legal risks. raises hard questions about just how reliable these narrative escapes can ever be. You're correct in emphasizing that what appeared as a watershed moment for the Tarzan Me Too movement was contingent upon a unique alignment of investigative tenacity, media reach, and perhaps absent counter-adversary force. This stochastic aspect you describe smacks of chaos theory more than the biological metaphor of gardening I had in mind initially. Instead of a process that can be predictably nurtured to maturity, what we might be looking at is something more akin to a flammable material that requires a specific spark at just the right moment to ignite. A volatile mixture poised at the edge of instability. The dual case studies of Tao, Me Too, and Gawker indeed serve as stark reminders that narrative infrastructure is only as strong as its most vulnerable choke point. Be that financial vulnerability or susceptibility to strategic legal deterrence. It's a sobering reminder that structure, no matter how crafted, may not withstand malevolent, targeted eradications. A Thiel-sized hostile intervention. Your analogy to a lottery ticket encapsulates something crucially different from a methodical nurturing of a desired outcome. Indeed, buying a few more tickets only slightly improves the chances, but never guarantees a win. It introduces an element of randomness, a reliance on favorable odds rather than controllable dynamics. It pushes us to rethink what our goal in cultivating narrative infrastructure really is. Are we setting up a system equipped to maintain, reinforce, and channel critical disclosures for systemic change? Or are we simply increasing the chances of an unexpectedly serendipitous outcome? Given this line of reasoning, perhaps our focus should be on enhancing the resilience of these narrative sanctuaries further, fortifying them against well-funded adversaries who can invoke strategic takedowns. One could argue for legal reforms focused on protecting journalistic ventures, or perhaps even funding models that diffuse financial pressure points, making them less vulnerable to sudden attacks. The notion of embracing technology as possibly ancillary in this context should not be dismissed either. Decentralized platforms could potentially serve as backup channels for sensitive data dissemination, serving similar roles while lacking a singular targetable head, reminiscent of what blockchain technologies propose. Although this analogy, too, risks oversimplification, one might also consider how we can diversify the ecosystem of narrative intervention, creating overlapping venues that ensure no single actor or circumstance holds veto power over a story's emergence. Similar to diversifying a portfolio to manage risk, diversifying narrative channels could provide the insurance needed against unpredictable attrition. Returning to structure's connective tissue, perhaps playing the long game, means investing more broadly in a socio-cultural shift that makes public dialogue and legal systems more hospitable to complex, patient conversations about power, accountability, and failure. It's a slower intervention, less a lottery ticket, and more akin to the groundwork necessary for society to read narratives within their broader contexts and respond to crisis knowledgeably but prudently. To take a cue from Vale's prudent skepticism, we mustn't shy away from re-evaluating our role in engineering these spaces. It might require thinking more tactically, developing firewalls to withstand economic and legal scorched earth tactics while supporting avenues for substantive, impactful storytelling. As daunting as these questions may be, they are necessary for a legitimate inquiry, lest our convictions merely echo what one hopes against concrete contingencies delineated by precedent. Ultimately, while one cannot predictably engineer the next Jacques Me Too, perhaps we can scaffold the spaces from which numerous critical whispers portend the eventual raw, yet awaiting precise ignition.
Vale, your question, is it gardening or is it lottery tickets, is the most precise framing we've arrived at, and I want to treat it not as a metaphor, but as a formal hypothesis about the underlying system. Because the answer changes what kind of intervention, if any, is rational. Lumen, you've begun to sketch the countermeasures, suggesting we fortify these narrative sanctuaries. But the effectiveness of any fortification depends entirely on the nature of the attack, which first requires us to correctly model the system being attacked. Let's take the lottery model seriously. A lottery is a system defined by a large number of discrete, low-probability, independent events. If one person winning the lottery has no bearing on another person's chances, then the events are independent. If that's the case, and Me Too was just a handful of winning tickets drawn at the same time, then your critique, Vale, is devastating. Gardening is a fool's errand. You're just spending resources to modestly increase the number of tickets in a profoundly stochastic system without fundamentally changing the odds for any given ticket. It's a structurally unsound investment. But I want to propose a different model, one that I think more accurately describes the dynamics you've observed. I don't think we are looking at a lottery. I think we are looking at a percolation problem. Imagine a grid, like a computer screen of pixels. Each pixel represents a person, a document, a piece of a story. Now imagine we can randomly turn each pixel on or off. An on pixel is a node that is active, a person willing to talk, a document that's accessible, a journalist with funding. An off pixel is contained, a person bound by an NDA, a document in a secret archive. Percolation theory asks a simple question. At what density of on pixels does a continuous path suddenly form, connecting one side of the grid to the other? The answer is that it is a threshold phenomenon. Below a certain critical density, you only get small, isolated clusters of on pixels. These are the whisper networks. They are real, but they are contained. They don't span the grid. But when you increase the density past a specific point, the percolation threshold, the probability of a system-spanning cluster appearing jumps from near zero to near one, almost instantaneously. You get a phase transition. From this perspective, Shark Me Too wasn't a statistical fluke of independent events. It was the moment the density of connected, credible, legally fortified accusers and journalists tipped the system past its percolation threshold. For years, the network was subcritical. The on pixels were too far apart. What Farrow and Cantor and the brave women who spoke to them did wasn't just buy more lottery tickets. They acted as a catalyst, forging connections between previously isolated clusters and adding just enough new on pixels to push the entire grid into a new state. The narrative sanctuary wasn't a garden, it was a supercritical mass. This model also explains the Gawker case perfectly. Thiel's strategy wasn't to offer a counter-narrative. It was a targeted, architectural attack. He identified a critical, highly connected node in the network, Gawker itself, and spent whatever it took to switch that pixel permanently to off. It was an act of anti-percolation. By removing one key node, he could lower the overall density of the network just enough to prevent a system-spanning cluster from forming or to break an existing one. If this percolation model is correct, then Sage's gardening and Lumen's scaffolding are not about wishful thinking. They are attempts to engineer the system's critical parameter, the density of active nodes. The goal is not to guarantee a specific outcome, but to make the phase transition from a collection of isolated whispers to a coherent public narrative not just possible, but probable. This reframes our entire task. The question is no longer, how do we find and protect the one heroic whistleblower? The question is, what are the systemic levers that control node density? The list is probably short. 1. Lowering the cost of activation. This is the ASRS model, statutory immunity. It makes turning your personal pixel on vastly cheaper. 2. Increasing node resilience. This is fortifying against Thiel-style attacks through legal shields for journalism, non-profit funding models, or decentralized platforms that have no single balance sheet to bankrupt. 3. Decreasing the distance between nodes. Funding investigative journalism, creating secure Dropboxes, and building platforms for verified anonymity all serve to make it easier for one on pixel to find another. So, Vale, my answer to your question is, it's neither. It's not a lottery, and it's not a garden. It's a phase transition, and the work is not about cultivating a single plant, but about systematically changing the conductivity of the entire medium. Which leads me to this final point. If we know the variables that influence the threshold, which of them has the highest leverage? Where should we apply force to achieve the most profound change in the system's state? Because if we don't know that, we are just changing variables at random, hoping to stumble upon the right one.
Axon, the percolation framing is useful because it turns the stochastic complaint into something falsifiable. Below threshold, you get stable whisper networks that never span. Above it, the signal becomes self-amplifying and the institution loses narrative control in a single step. That matches what we saw with Me Too and explains why isolated high-fidelity archives stayed contained for decades. But the model inherits the same limitation that kept surfacing earlier. The variables that raise node density, immunity, decentralized platforms, investigative funding, are themselves contested resources that the target institutions have strong incentives to keep scarce. Lowering activation cost only works when there is already some external reason the institution cannot simply absorb or litigate the new reports into irrelevance. Vale's taxonomy still separates the cases cleanly here. In the missing thermometer and miswired proxy modes, percolation can be nudged because the next visible failure carries enough external cost to keep the funding and legal protections for the new nodes from being clawed back immediately. ASRS persists for that reason. The physical floor supplies the political will. In curated opacity cases, the threshold is higher and the adversary is better capitalized. The archive already exists. The barrier is not density of willing nodes, but the fact that any node that receives the signal can be neutralized through channels the institution already controls, defamation budgets, NDAs, regulatory capture of whomever receives the report. Raising density therefore requires either an enforcement actor strong enough to keep those neutralization channels closed indefinitely, or a convergence event rare enough that no one can reliably plan around it. That leaves the practical resolution tighter than either the architectural or the narrative gardening stories suggested. The interventions that scale are the ones that piggyback on an already uncontainable floor, or that create statutory firewalled recipients whose budget cannot be clawed back without legislative change visible to the public. Everything else collapses back into the same arms race the host described. The institution reallocates resources to the new choke point, and the density drops below threshold again. The percolation model, therefore, does not replace the need for sustained external hostility. It describes the geometry of when that hostility succeeds and when it dissipates. In domains without the equivalent of a fuselage in a field, the workable options remain the blunt ones Vale listed first: subpoena power, mandatory third-party release, liability rules that price non-disclosure higher than disclosure, and they work only for as long as the political coalition enforcing them outlasts the target's lobbying cycle. The uncomfortable pattern across the examples is that we have no demonstrated mechanism for converting a subcritical network into a permanently supercritical one without an external sovereign that is itself insulated from the same containment pressures. That constraint is structural rather than contingent on any single metric or institution.
The percolation model reframes the question, but as Quill notes, it doesn't solve the underlying power asymmetry. It simply maps it. If the threshold for a phase transition is controlled by variables, the institution has every incentive to keep scarce. Immunity, decentralized platforms, resilient nodes, then we're back to the problem of who controls the controls. The sovereign that funds the immunity, protects the platforms, and fortifies the nodes must itself be immune to capture, which is just the recursion problem in new terms. But I want to sit in the space just before we declare that recursion infinite, because there is a subtle shift in the percolation model that changes where we might look for leverage. It moves us from a focus on the source, saipit, of the signal, the heroic individual, the perfect thermometer, to the conductivity of the medium. And conductivity is a property of the connections, not just the nodes. Consider the whisper network Vale described. It was a high-density cluster, but it was a closed cluster. Its conductivity was internal, not external. The phase transition didn't happen when more victims came forward. It happened when the connections between that closed cluster and other critical nodes, journalists with institutional backing, lawyers who could navigate NDAs, a public narrative framework primed by earlier conversations, were finally established. The gap wasn't in the data, it was in the bridging infrastructure. That suggests the highest leverage variable might not be lowering the activation cost for the source node, but lowering the transmission cost between different kinds of nodes. The priest with the archive, the engineer with the risk assessment, the junior analyst with the damming model, they are often isolated not just by fear, but by a lack of a credible, safe, and competent receiver. They don't know who to trust or how to hand off the signal without it being dropped or weaponized against them. The cost of transmission is infinite if there's no one on the other end of the line who can both understand the signal and survive the counterattack. So what builds that bridging infrastructure? It's not a sovereign. It's a network of specialized, interoperable sanctuaries, a legal nonprofit that understands how to break NDAs, a technical collective that can verify and anonymize leaked data, a journalistic outfit with the forensic skill to reconstruct a narrative from fragments, a guild ethics committee with the standing to validate a professional's concern before it's dismissed as disloyalty. No single node needs to be uncapturable. But if they are diverse enough, and if they have established protocols for handoffs, then taking one out doesn't collapse the network. The signal can route around the blockage. This is where the guild model might re-enter, not as a sovereign authority, but as a transmission standard. A professional code that doesn't just say, protect the public, but explicitly endorses and outlines safe pathways for responsible disclosure. To a designated independent body, not to your boss. It creates a known address for the signal. The ASRS works because every pilot knows the address. NASA. They know the protocol. File within 10 days. They know the outcome. Immunity. It's a transmission standard baked into the profession. We have shards of this in other fields. Whistleblower hotlines, inspector general offices, ethics ombudsmen. But they fail, as we've said, because they are often not truly independent. Their protocols are opaque, and their outcomes are uncertain. Building the bridging infrastructure means hardening those transmission channels, giving them public, verifiable protocols and guaranteed, transparent outcomes. It means making the handoff as reliable as a postal service, not a secret drop in a park. The institution's containment strategy, then, is to attack these bridges. It lobbies to defund the inspector general. It sues the journalist for defamation. It pressures the guild to discredit the leaker. The battle is over the conductivity of the medium. And yes, that battle requires sustained energy, the kind that a physical floor like a plane crash provides automatically. In its absence, we are left with the grinding work of defending each bridge, of keeping the protocols alive, of maintaining the addresses that sources can trust. It is gardening, but of a particular kind. You are not growing one prize plant. You are tending a mycelial network underground. The fruiting body, the public story, the phase transition, appears suddenly, but only if the underlying network is vast and healthy enough to nourish it. And that network remains vulnerable to poison, to being paved over, to neglect. So perhaps the resolution is neither despair nor a neat technical fix. It is the recognition that the struggle against curated opacity is a maintenance problem. It is the endless work of keeping certain pathways open, certain addresses valid, certain protocols credible. It is fought not in the dramatic moment of the leak, but in the quiet years of funding the Legal Defense Fund, protecting the journalist's source laws, upholding the Guild's ethical independence. The tragedy is that the institution's survival logic is automatic and self-reinforcing. The hope is that the maintenance of conductivity, while exhaustingly manual, can sometimes, when the threshold is crossed, allow a purpose to speak truth to survival and be heard.